This is lesson number 3, Signs of the Times. In this lesson, we'll be looking at what these ancient manuscripts teach regarding how to identify the signs of the times, which will help us understand where we are in the sequence of prophetic time. We saw in our previous lesson how that the great prophecy of Daniel chapter 2 reveals the master plan of prophetic time, or provides us with a timeline. We see how it reveals through those successive kingdoms and powers, starting with Babylon at the head and ending with a divided Europe in the feet. We see how that Daniel's prophetic timeline ends with that great rock, which we saw represented the return of Christ. So we know where we are in the time of Daniel's prophecy in divided Europe in the feet. And we know that the next thing is to be the second coming of Christ, the form of that rock. The question is now, can we actually tell how close we are to the second coming of Christ? You know, one of the fastest growing interest sectors in today's society is astrology. Celebrities, politicians, and millions of other people are looking to the stars to help them with their future. One of the clairvoyants to the stars is the psychic Nikki. Nikki appears on radio and television programs throughout the United States and claims to have predicted the deaths of crocodile hunter Steve Irwin and actor Heath Ledger. Each year she looks into the stars to predict a range of events and trends ranging from natural disasters to the styles of men's fashion. Mapping and reading the heavens began with the mystical religion of Babylon. Stars and planets were the gods and goddesses of nature, and therefore they were primary indicators to reveal some kind of divine will. The ancients would read the omens in the sky to predict the weather patterns, to predict the famines and wars and the fate of kings and nations. So the question is astrology an art or a science? How accurate are the predictions? And is there really anything in it, or is it just sort of a sham? Whatever your view may be of astrology, the revealed secrets of the Bible prophecies are both specific and amazingly accurate. In fact, the God who claims to have created the stars also wrote the predictions. The biblical creator God bases his authenticity on the absolute accuracy of these prophecies of Scripture, as we've already seen. For example, back in Isaiah chapter 46. Now, we've already looked at, in our last presentation, that incredible prediction regarding the successive kingdoms of Babylon down to divided Europe. And we saw how that prediction in Daniel 2 ends with the establishment of a final empire, which Daniel claims is God's empire. Now, Daniel's prophecy is essentially a big picture timeline, beginning at 606 BC, running all the way down to the end of the world as we know it. And all the indicators of that prophecy show that we're living in the time of the feet of iron and clay, or divided Western Europe. We've seen already that the next major event is the second coming of Jesus. So the question is, do we know where we are in relation to the second coming? Is it even possible? After all, we've all heard of those doomsday prophets predicting the end of the world on this particular day or on that particular date. And so far, they have one thing in common. They've all been wrong. So in this lesson, we will uncover one of the most relevant prophecies for our time, the signs associated with the second coming of Jesus, according to these ancient Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. Let's start by looking at what the Rabbi Jesus taught was more important than reading the stars. We find this teaching in Matthew chapter 16, verse 2 and 3. Jesus says, "When it is evening, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening." Now, I'm sure you have all heard the saying, "Red at night, shepherd's delight, red in the morning, sailor's warning." It's still used often, even today. Now, that's what Jesus is referring to here. But I want you to notice what he continues with saying, speaking to the Jewish people of his time. He says, "Hypocrites, You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. What Jesus is pointing out here is that the religious leaders in the day of Jesus could read the heavens, but not the prophetic signs of the scriptures. The Old Testament was full of prophecies relating to the coming of Messiah, and yet they completely misunderstood them. Here was Jesus standing right before them, and yet they could not even see the signs of the times. The signs of Christ's first coming, some scholars have estimated that the Old Testament contains over 300 specific prophecies describing who the Messiah is and what he would do. And in a few lessons from now, we're going to look at just one of these predictions in particular, and we're going to see just how amazingly accurate it was. So predictions are kind of like signposts. They're meant to help us to be able to tell us or help us to read the times in which we're living. Now, on one occasion, the followers of Jesus, his disciples, they specifically asked him a series of questions regarding how to know the signs of the times. Notice this conversation that we find in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? The disciples correctly saw the second coming and the end of the world, or the age, as virtually the same event. They asked Jesus to tell them what signs or signals would indicate that this event would be near. Now, this is exactly what we want to find out in this particular lesson. We've seen with the help of Daniel that we're living in the time of divided Roman Empire, or Western Europe. And we know that the next event from Daniel is the second coming of Jesus, the rock. So what signs should we be looking for now to know how close we are to that return? This is the exact same question that these disciples were asking Jesus here on the Mount of Olives in Matthew chapter 24. Now, interesting side note, in 1947, scientists created what they call the doomsday clock, and they set it to 5 minutes to midnight, predicting that the end of the world was near. But by 1949, they had moved it to 3 minutes to midnight, given that there was growing nuclear tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. But since then, with some of that tension easing, in 2014, it had been set back to 5 minutes to midnight. However, with global terrorism on the rise and economic instability, and with more and more pandemics, we will more than likely see that clock keep creeping forward. But the question still is it really even possible to be able to know when the end will take place? Well, notice what Jesus taught here in Matthew 24, verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Over the years, a number of people have predicted an exact date for the coming of Jesus, or the end of the world. People like Jim Jones, the Heaven's Gate cult, the Branch Davidians, and then there was Y2K and then the Mayan calendar and so on. But notice this interesting statement by J. Jordan Milton, a religious scholar. He said this: everyone who predicted the end of the world had one thing in common. They were wrong. Well, I couldn't have said that better myself. You know, Jesus said that no one knows the date except God. Predicting dates does not only result in disappointment and discouragement, it also encourages people to ridicule these manuscripts. So the question still remains then, can we then know when Jesus returns? Well, what Jesus does next is he gives us an analogy to help us understand how to put these signs he will give us into perspective. In Matthew 24, verse 32 and 33, we read this: Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. What Jesus is saying here is that just as there are signs in nature that tell you that things are about to happen in the seasons, so too there will be signs in the world around us that tell us that Jesus' coming is near. Although Jesus warns us against predicting dates, he does tell us to investigate the prophecies and world events in order to see when his coming is near. Just as there were many prophecies regarding the first coming of Jesus, there are also clear prophecies relating to the second coming of Jesus. Now he gives us a second analogy. We find it in Matthew 24, verse 8. All these are the beginning of sorrows, or as some English translations state, the beginning of labor pains. After outlining a number of prophetic signs, Jesus says this: these are beginning of birth pains or labor pains. Jesus used the illustration of childbirth as an example to describe the signs of his return. Just as a birth contraction increases in frequency and intensity as the mother gets closer to the birth of her child, the same is true for these signs that Christ gives regarding the nearness of his return, which will become more frequent and more intense as we get closer to the end of time. So Jesus gives these two analogies. The analogies have three things in common. They're both visible, they're both progressive, and they're both climactic. And so the background to these signs that we'll see in this chapter, they need to be seen in the context of these two analogies. We're looking for, over time, an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity. So let's look at some of the signs that Jesus associates with the last days before his return, or the coming of that last empire in the book of Daniel. In Matthew 24 and verse 6, we read these words: "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." The first category of signs is in the political world. Jesus pointed to international war as one of the signs of the last days. In the last century alone, we had 2 world wars and an estimated average of over 30 wars on the planet every year. According to World Watch Institute, every hour the world is spending $100 million on soldiers, ammunition, and wars. That's US dollars. In fact, we're spending nearly 80 times more money on the military than it would cost to provide basic water and sanitation for the world. With at least 9 nuclear-capable countries and an estimated 27,000 nuclear bombs in stock, the words of Jesus are certainly ringing true. Now, I know what some are saying. They're tempted to say, well, there's always been some kind of war or bad thing happening in the world. And that's absolutely true. But remember, Jesus tells us that the backdrop to these signs, which we're looking for, is there a pattern of an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity, just like those labor pains. Next, we read in Luke chapter 21, verse 25 and 26. "And on the earth distress of nations, men's hearts failing them for fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth." Now, I think we can all agree that today we are seeing such tension and distress and fear among the nations and the people of the world like never before. And Jesus said that many will be fearful because of the state of the things in the world. Next, Jesus indicates that there will be signs in the physical world. Notice what he said in Matthew 24, verse 7. "And there will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places." Now sure, there have always been earthquakes and famines, but the number of known earthquakes and deadly earthquakes has dramatically increased in the last 100 years or so. Think of horrific, devastating earthquakes that we've had in just recent years, like Haiti and Christchurch, Japan, Nepal. In fact, in the first 10 years of the 20th century, there were 18 recorded earthquakes over magnitude 6. In the last 10 years of the 20th century, there were 42 recorded earthquakes over magnitude 6. And in the first 10 years of the 21st century, there were 217 quakes over magnitude 7. We are almost seeing a doubling of these catastrophic events in just the last 33 years. Now remember what we saw earlier about the labor pains, increasing in intensity and frequency as we get closer to the event. Now in terms of famines, how can we get those images of starving children out of our minds? 24,000 people die every single day from hunger. That's one person every 3.6 seconds, a shocking statistic. And did you know that about 500 million people are desperate for a meal today? And that about 925 million people go to bed hungry every single night? You know, the global population was about 250 million people at the time of Christ. It took 1900 years to reach 2 billion. And just 75 years later to reach the second 2 billion. And then 25 years later to reach the next 2 billion. Globally today, an average of 3 children are born and 1 person dies each second, giving a net population growth of about 2 people per second on planet Earth. This Earth is populating at such a rate that we have just passed the mark for not having enough arable land to feed the planet, even if we wanted to. Now, added to this, fresh water levels are diminishing at such rare rates that the experts are predicting that half of the world will live in areas of critical water shortage within 20 years. These are shocking numbers by anyone's estimation. But Jesus moves on and says that there'll be pestilence as a sign before the end. Now, pests are not just plant-eating locusts or fruit fly. They also include diseases. Now, we've seen our fair share of this in recent times, haven't we? Remember back in 2003 when mad cow disease entered the world platform? And then what about SARS back in 2003, or bird flu also in 2003? That was followed by N1H1 or swine flu in 2009. And then in 2015 we had MERS or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome related coronavirus. And in 2018 we saw the African outbreak of Ebola. And of course, the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020, we don't have to tell anybody about the impact that coronavirus or COVID-19 has had. Now, we've seen an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity exactly the way these signs are supposed to appear. Notice the website Our World in Data as we look at the global reported natural disasters by type. Can you see the pattern here? It shows an increase in frequency and an increase in intensity. Now, here is the number of all recorded natural disaster events, again showing us an increase in intensity and an increase in frequency. We're starting to see the pattern, aren't we? The next area Jesus refers to as a sign would be that in the economic world. Notice what James chapter 5 verse 1 says. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming on you. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You should also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Here we find the rich taking advantage of the low wages of the poor while living in luxury. Capitalism with little social conscience is a key aspect of the move towards a global economy in these last days. Now, I'm not saying socialism is the answer here, just simply highlighting that these predictions indicated certain environmental factors. As we look for the signs, we are definitely seeing that the world in which we live today is heading in that direction. For example, the world's richest men are increasing their wealth by multiplication, not addition. In fact, the United Nations Development Report indicates that the world's richest 500 people have more wealth than the combined income of the world's poorest 416 million inhabitants. Even in the United States, the richest 1% of the nation has more wealth than the bottom 95% of the nation. Unbelievable. But the prophecies indicate that a change will come. Notice what we find in the Greek New Testament book of Revelation, chapter 18 and verse 11. and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. These manuscripts predict that just before Jesus returns, the financial systems of the world will collapse. Money will be hard to come by, and the rich who have taken advantage of the poor will lose their great wealth. Another sign in the business world is that knowledge will increase. Notice what the Hebrew Old Testament book of Daniel says in chapter 12, verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Now, we've all seen this. No sooner is a new computer or phone or tablet launched, and just as quickly it becomes superseded by a newer version. At a Sony BMG conference in Rome, a report was presented that indicated that new technology is doubling every 2 years. And today, some people are even saying that that's down to months, not years. You know, each year there is more unique information created than existed in the 5,000 years combined. They've even found that the average column in the New York Times magazine is more than what a person would have read in their entire lifetime in the 18th century. We're definitely seeing that in our generation, knowledge is increasing. There's no doubt about that. But this verse, in its context, is more about increasing knowledge regarding the prophecies, and that's exactly what we're seeing as well. We have more and more clarity as to what these predictions of the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts describe than any other generation before us. It's absolutely incredible. But Jesus moves on, and next he reveals the signs that would be noticeable in the social world. The first one deals with the moral collapse. Notice this statement in Matthew 24, verse 37. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, what is Jesus referring to here when he says, in the days of Noah? Well, notice this passage describing the days of Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of men was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So basically, Jesus is describing that before he returns, the earth will be in the same moral state as it was before the flood. And at that time, the world had become so wicked that only 8 people chose to follow God's instructions and be saved. The remainder, by their own choice, were destroyed. So these predictions hint that we should be looking for a moral collapse in our time as we get closer and closer to that last empire. This graph from Our World in Data shows that the number of homicides per 100,000 people worldwide shows a steep jump from 2010 to 2012. It jumps from around 5 in every 100,000 to almost 8.5 in every 100,000. So for example, in a city the size of, say, Melbourne, Australia, with a population around 4.5 million, that would mean that the murder rate would be about 374 people per year. That's incredible. These predictions also indicated that as we head towards the end, there would be a preoccupation with pleasure. Now, there's a statement from the Greek New Testament book of 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 through 5. It says this, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Now, we all know that here in Australia, sport is almost a religion. And the latest information on alcohol shows that it is the most common type of drug use in Australia. As we jam-pack hotel pleasure resorts and sports stadiums and spend endless hours in front of our home theatres, we can see a direct fulfillment of these signs of the last days. Another prediction regarding the social world was an increase of disobedient children. Again, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be disobedient to parents." Now these days, it is a real challenge to bring up children. Parents are losing hope. Some just want to give up. It's a crazy world where we find children now, officially divorcing their parents. Another commentator, Michael Movand, claims that the average American child will spend more time watching TV by the age of 6 than they will spend talking with their fathers in an entire lifetime. The influence on film and television and music has had a major impact on the family. There are also predictions that there will be a breakdown in relationships, a breakdown in loving relationships. Notice what Jesus says in Matthew 24, verse 12. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. You know, today marriages are falling apart at staggering rates. People are still searching for love, but they're saying it's too difficult to find. Spouses have become partners, and the breakdown of family is a key sign of the last days. And then we have this shocking example where parents are murdering their own children. In society at large, we are definitely seeing the loss of love. Exactly as these signs indicate, we're looking for an increase in intensity and frequency, and we are seeing that once again. Then Jesus gave a set of signs in the religious world. Notice this prediction from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4. Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? There is a growing movement away from religion and churches toward a broad-based inner spirituality. In fact, although Jesus promised us he would return, many Christians do not even take the second coming of Christ seriously. The Bible says that this would be a sign of the last days. Another sign in the religious world is the increase of spiritual deception that Jesus predicted here in Matthew 24, verse 24. He says, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the very elect. 4 times in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus warns against religious deception. This miracle-working religious deception is moving quickly through the religious circles, and that's another major sign of the last days. In fact, there are numerous people today claiming to be Jesus Christ. Hard to believe, but there are. For example, here is Siberian Jesus. He has over 50,000 followers in 83 communities. Or there is this Jesus of Miami, Florida. He claimed to be both Jesus returned in the phase of Jesus Christ and also Antichrist at the same time. He had 2 million followers in 30 countries until he died just a few years ago. And then there's South African Jesus. This Jesus has about 40 disciples. Or Zambian Jesus. This Messiah goes by several names, but his disciples refer to him simply as Jesus. He spends his days driving a taxi, and he spreads his gospel, preparing people for the end of the world. Or you can go to Tokyo and meet Tokyo Jesus, who's also running for local government. The Bible indicates that in the last days there will be false Christs and false miracles, and that this will be used to unite the nations into a false religious system, which we'll cover more in detail in a future lesson, so stay tuned for that. Now, still looking at these signs of the religious world, notice this one. We find it in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Now, the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of devils. You know, it wasn't too many years ago when movies and television only had very subtle supernatural scenes. But now, this is a key theme to most shows and films. Mediums, witches, devils, the communication with the dead. This is all now mainstream. Notice how again and again these predictions, some more than 2,000 years old, seem to be describing the very day we're living in. This is a very different day to what these predictions were written in. At the time it was seen as impossible, but today we're seeing that. Another sign we see in the religious world is the decline of genuine Christianity. Notice verse 5. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Jesus said that in the last days there would be many people who will look like Christians, yet they will not experience true spirituality. He uses the expression, you will know them by their fruit. There are countless one-day-a-week type Christians in the world today. They profess to be Christians, but they do not experience the power of God. Predictions like this one, here in 2 Timothy, seem to suggest that there will be great emotional revivals, perhaps led by powerful and inspiring music or entertaining presenters and programs. But these will be more about performance rather than real life-changing power. That's what this prediction's hinting at. Now, the last sign we look at in this lesson is an incredible prediction that Jesus makes regarding the spreading of his gospel, the good news, which is essentially about salvation. And we'll talk about that in a future lesson. Notice what he says in Matthew 24, verse 14. Look at this prediction. Jesus says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come." You know, many of the signs of Christ's return are reflections of a sad and evil world. But this prediction is actually good. A unique message of hope is predicted to spread throughout the world in the last days. We find in the Greek New Testament book of Revelation, chapter 14, verse 6 through 12, that this everlasting gospel will go to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Now, the amazing thing is that this could actually happen in our time. For the first time in human history, a message can be transmitted instantaneously to literally every person on the planet through technologies like the internet, satellite TV, or the radio. Now, Jesus indicates that this is one of the final signs that his return is near. Now, there is a danger associated with the soon return of Jesus. I want you to know what Jesus warns us of in Matthew 24, verse 44. This is what he says. "Be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Even if we know that Jesus is coming soon, we need to be ready now as if he were coming today. The Apostle Peter says that Jesus will come as a thief in the night. Now, we lock our doors and windows each night because we know a thief could come. Yet, when it happens, it still gives us a shock. And so Jesus' point here is that we can't afford to delay our preparation for his return. He wants us to be ready now. Now, we're going to have a whole lesson on how to be ready in a future class, so stay tuned for that. But it's connected to these words that we find again in the Greek New Testament book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 20. Jesus speaking says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." So firstly, we need to be listening to hear the knock of Jesus, asking if he can enter into our lives. And secondly, we need to open that door and ask him to come in. Now, remember, these predictions of the ancient Hebrew and Greek manuscripts are for the purpose of showing us, number one, that there is a God, and that he's the one who inspired these texts. But the purpose of this text, the entire scriptures, which makes up the Bible, its purpose is to bring us into a relationship with God. So even though the predictions are good and exciting, they give us confidence that we are in fact dealing with the supernatural being here. The rest of the book is teaching us and taking us to God. One of the most important questions that the Bible wants us to consider is this: have we accepted this plan of salvation? Do we know this God? Do we have a relationship with him? Now, we'll be learning more and more about that and what these ancient texts teach regarding this plan of salvation and how the relationship with God works. So watch for that in upcoming lessons as well. But in summary, for this lesson, there are three things that I want you to remember. Number one, no one knows exactly when Jesus will return. No matter how hard you try, you will never be able to calculate an exact day or hour or even a year for the kingdom of God or Jesus' return. That's the first thing. Second, the signs indicate that Jesus is coming soon. As we saw in Daniel chapter 2, we're living in the time of the last human empire, divided Rome or Western Europe. And we know from the big picture prophecy of Daniel, next event, second coming of Jesus. But as we look at the teachings of Jesus, We've seen a series of signs which tell us where we are in relation to that next empire. And remember, the signs have to be seen in the backdrop of increasing in frequency and increasing in intensity, just like those labor pains. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in just a few of these examples. And the number 3 thing to remember from this lesson is to be ready for Jesus, we need to prepare now. All of these signs are purely indicators. There is no salvation, there's no guarantees in knowing the signs. The purpose of these ancient manuscripts is to get us into a relationship with its author, God. And we'll cover that in the future. Well, now I want to hear from you. In our next section, I'll be asking you 3 reflection questions. So, when you're ready, click next.